I'm Big Don Luca, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Hi, welcome to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your host, Will. I'm joined here by my co-host, Jaren.
What is up, guys?
Today, we are going to be getting into some more season in reviews. Just a joyous occasion over here at the Mainstream Mavs podcast. We have a different fresh threshold that we are reaching today with some of these players. Today, we are going to be profiling the 2022-2023 season of Dwight Powell, Frank Ntilikina, and JaVale McGee. A little more, bougie than the last podcast where we showcased Davis Bertans, Markieff Morris, and
Justin Holiday.
But nonetheless, definitely still, I think a little bit more of a sort of loaded podcast here as we get into the Mavericks center rotation a little bit with Dwight and JaVale. Two spots that I think a lot of Mavs fans were hoping would sort of be inversed in terms of the roles that Dwight and JaVale played on this team this year. But nonetheless, with the JaVale signing last offseason, not really coming fully into fruition, Dwight was asked to play an extended role on this team, as he does basically time out and time again every year. And it was definitely, I think, more of a subtle Dwight Powell year than maybe in the last few years prior. And definitely a more of an albatross JaVale McGee year, contrary to what we saw in his Warriors and Suns days and Cavs days as of recent. But they did still help the team in certain areas, despite a lot of their shortcomings that we harped on ad nauseum throughout the season. Definitely some of the more frustrating players. In terms of Frank, he just didn't really play a whole lot. So, it's going to be an interesting synopsis, maybe just kind of getting into the sort of dynamics of his career and what he has at stake. I think that that's going to be more of the talking point than the actual on-court product. But in terms of JaVale and Dwight, there's definitely some, sustainability questions there in terms of if those guys are going to be back in Dallas. But with that being said, they are still in JaVale's scenario. He still has 2 more years left on his deal. Dwight, it's still kind of all signs are pointing towards him possibly being back on a minimum deal. So we do have to, really take into account what these guys could bring to the team next year, even if it takes an even steeper decline than last year. So we'll be getting all into it in our sort of pessimistic roundabout. But before we start, Jaren, do you have anything in terms of these guys that we're getting out here today?
Yeah, I mean, only one is technically under contract so far or remaining, because I do believe that Frank and Dwight are technically unrestricted free agents. So
you're correct.
But I would not be surprised to see Dwight back in a Mavericks uniform. So I think it is important that we do tally, what is important and what they can bring back to this team. For Frank, I think it's more of a case where he just didn't get enough minutes to really produce. But in Frank's book, I know we're going to get more into him in detail, but I do think we saw more positive out of him than almost anyone on this who we're about to talk about. So I think in terms of Frank, he was probably one of the better, more positive players. He definitely had a weirder year, but I mean, that's I think that's probably going to take us, through this podcast. But yeah, without further ado, here is an ad from our sponsor, Spotify for Podcasters.
All right, Jaren. So getting into it here with the Dwight Powell, you don't mind just reading off his season counting stats. What did you see from this guy in terms of his strengths and weaknesses this year, comparable to his prior season with the Mavericks?
Yeah, so I mean, real quick, I'll just count off his stats. In 19 minutes, he averaged just about 7 points per game, 73% field goal percentage, 66% from the line, 4 rebounds, almost an assist, and that's pretty much about it. And a turnover a game, if that accounts for anything.
How many minutes a game did he play?
What was it?
How many minutes per game did he play?
19.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think going into the season, we weren't really expecting much from Dwight, if anything at all. Like, I think, if we wrote down the roster, he'd probably be the third or fourth big on the roster, at least in the depth chart. So I don't think, we were really expecting much out of him, but clearly, 15 games into the season, he elevated into a role that we honestly didn't really expect him to have. And then very soon after that, he was starting, and he pretty much started every single game after that. I want to say he didn't play the first like 3 games of the season, and then, pretty much played 76 games through the rest of the season. So I think, for his role, like, his was much of a, just substitute kind of role where, basically he's going to be a spot starter. That's again, that's what we saw last year, and that's exactly what we saw this year. So I wouldn't say much changed outside of, any positives. I think that there was a lot more negatives that loomed throughout this year, just as the season went along. I think we saw the regression that Dwight took, if you would say that, or just the sort of, copy and paste attitude that he has as like year per year goes along. So I think that we didn't really see anything too positive out of him outside of being a guy that, you can rely on to be that sort of substitute guy, or a guy that you comes in given an injury, or in this case, JaVale McGee just not being the JaVale McGee that we thought he would be. And he came in and, to his credit, he did have some handful of good games. I think as the season went along, especially those last probably 5 to 10 games, I would say he definitely picked the ball up and actually, offensively got some things going. But I would say from an offensive perspective, especially, I didn't really see much positive. I know he was in the like 99th percentile or 98th percentile whenever it came to bigs or like rolling bigs in the 21-22 season. But in the 22-23 season, I think he was still pretty high in that percentile, but nothing that I think we saw of the Dwight Powell of old.
For fans that wouldn't necessarily be too keen to Dwight Powell being on the Mavericks next year, and have definitely been in the sort of hater club per se, you pointed towards a lot of things that he does well, but like, what is the case for Dwight Powell to return to the Mavericks next year from that perspective? Like, money aside, what does he bring to the court positively that maybe the average NBA fan doesn't see?
Yeah, I mean, like, clearly, like, he's been a Maverick for almost a decade now. Like, he knows this team inside and out. And so I think he's a good culture guy. He's a guy that of course he has what he's done around the city, like that bodes him positively on the court wise. I do think, given the right role, being like that third or possibly fourth center off the bench, I think that he, could be a really serviceable center. As we saw this like early in this season, I think, whenever we saw him come off the bench, I think is probably his best sort of role or sort of, place that we want to see him on this bench or on this team. But I think, as a starter, that's where you start to beg the question of, is he really worth what we're getting? And I would, simply say no. But, if he does come back on the right price, the minimum, whatever, I think you're just getting a good, not culture guy, because, I think culture guy has become such a negative connotation with this team. But I think that you are getting sort of, a guy who's reliable. I think that's probably the best way to put it. He is one of the top rolling bigs. And yes, his numbers did drop pretty extensively this year, but even still, you can pair him up with Luka Doncic and you know exactly what you're going to get. I think if you can pair him against the sort of backup centers in this league and not, Joel Embiid or even Jokic for that matter, like on the defensive side of things, I think that there's a lot more things that he can do to open up the floor. But yeah, you do have trouble whenever you're running into the Clint Capellas or Joel Embiids, the defensive centers, who pretty much, make him almost just irresputable, like not one of the worst players on the floor, but he just becomes basically a cog in the offense and he's just on the floor. So I think if you can find a way to plug and play him on the bench in a role that's suitable for this team where, like I said, he's playing, 10, 15 minutes a game, I think that's probably the best case for him. And coming off the minimum, I would be open to that.
No, 100%. I think that there's definitely a sort of built-in role for him if he was to return on a fair dollar amount. Whether that is going to happen remains to be seen. There's obviously some sort of convolution in terms of, the validity of if he's going to come back or not. I don't really think that people have really delved too deep into it, but it's definitely intriguing as we move towards this offseason, seeing what they're going to do with that open roster spot if they want to retain him for not obviously having been here since the Rondo trade. Slowly climbing up the Mavericks all-time games played list in an ever secret or almost like nonchalant fashion where nobody really even knows that he's got as high as he has already. And, you do make a good point. I think we saw a little less of the defensive liability earlier in the season when he was tasked more, and had to defer more to JaVale McGee or Christian Wood just in those first, 5 or 10 games that ensued. He was tasked a lot more to have to guard, opposing fives off the bench versus starters. And I definitely think that point was well made by you in terms of how much more, less of a liability he is on defense from that perspective. But other than that, conversely, a lot of Mavs fans, bear a lot of blame at Dwight Powell. And, we would probably save that and say it's not necessarily his fault, but maybe to an extent he is placed upon unfair positions at times just due to a lack of personnel. But nonetheless, we have enough of a sample size year to year to know that he is a defensive liability in most instances at center. And, he is not this sort of all-encompassing dynamic offensive threat at the 5, which isn't necessarily something that is a commonality between centers, I'd say, this day and age, but it definitely helps a big man stay on the floor, i.e. a Christian Wood, despite his shortcomings, he can do a lot more offensively than Dwight. So Dwight doesn't necessarily have that sort of niche that he appeals to in terms of one particular skill set. But he does everything, pretty decent, and he's a good roller. And he obviously, is, probably one of the more just hustle-minded, pure energy, gives all of his heart on every possession players on the team. What do you think of his weaknesses this past year? Given that, and what exactly is it due to, whether it be the position that he's putting in, or is it just, purely his physical shortcomings?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big thing, or a big part of, his sort of shortcomings, especially this year, has been his size, and not athleticism, but just really his size. Like he's so limited in what he can do. It almost makes him too one-dimensional on offense, if that makes any sense, because there's really not much you can do outside of the pick and roll if you're trying to include him. He can set some nice off-ball screens just to get a shooter open or whatever it may be. But
fake
in
DHOs at the
DHOs, like he's good at that. I do feel like at some points in the season he got lost on an island in those DHOs, and you don't really want him running downhill because either that's gonna be a lost dribble or he's just gonna throw up some wonky shot. So I think from that perspective, like there is a little bit of flexibility that you can do with him, but just from a big perspective, like to get him involved, to get him scoring, there's really not much you can do outside of the pick and roll. So I think he's just more of a one-dimensional kind of guy, and that's why, again, to bring it back to past conversation, I think like bringing him off the bench would probably be the best case scenario. But yeah, he's just so one-dimensional. But defensively, like that's where the size comes in handy, or that's where the size, I guess, in his case, doesn't come in handy, because he's just constantly beat either by bigger sort of centers in the league, like that, just using their body on him, or he's just too small to really do anything. His defensive shortcomings, what he did so well in the 21-22 campaign was he was able to be in the right place at the right time, was sort of able to roll into the right places and be there in sort of a plug and play fashion on the defensive side of things. But, what we saw this year is pretty much the total opposite. I think we saw him stuck one-on-one with a lot of guys. He would end up getting in foul trouble either really extremely early, if you're playing the Embiids or the Jokic's of the world on offense. But yeah, I mean, I just think the shortcomings, from a physical standpoint, have definitely limited him. I'm not going to say that this has been like his worst season or his worst, showcasing or whatever it may be, but I do think that this was probably the biggest year where, you have to question his sort of size and ability. Because I mean, at the end of the day, I don't know off the top of my head how old he is, but he's getting up there in age. Soon athleticism is going to start to dwindle down. I think that's probably a bright spot of his sort of career is that athleticism has at least, helped him out in sort of the size department. But I do think that's probably where his biggest shortcomings are, is in the physical standpoint, is that he is a shorter center, and there's really only a limited amount of things that he can do.
No, yeah, you bring up some good points there, and particularly, in regards to Dwight's defense, I would probably operate more under the mindset that it's kind of conducive to, just to, the position that he's put in terms of his struggles. I do think that there is something to affect, that he does, he doesn't have the longest wingspan. He's not the tallest guy ever. But he's a fairly uber athletic guy, particularly for his age. He's fast and he can jump high for his position. Maybe not all of that athleticism necessarily translates as fluidly as you would hope. But he's definitely a guy that, in the right position, can sort of, be optimized to an extent on defense. Now, what is that scenario exactly? Is that, the Mavericks running man? Is that the Mavericks running zone? I mean, we saw him, being connected on a string, as you alluded to, when the Mavericks were, when he was an integral part to an extent, maybe not necessarily in the playoff run, but towards the latter half of the regular season, when the Mavericks were on that sort of win streak there in the 2021-22 season. And, the Mavericks definitely, there would be incremental periods where they would mix in zone, and Dwight, he does a really good job rotating as the low man, and being able to recover and, sort of intercept passes in the dunker spot. He's always been, underrated in terms of being able to veer off of a seal. He tries to get, I see continuously a lot of centers think that they'll just basically have him pinned, and he's able to, work around them and sort of pull the chair on him right as that post entry pass is coming in. And, things like that are definitely an underrated aspect of his defensive game. But, in a scheme where the Mavericks maybe didn't play as much zone this year, you could definitely argue that some of their wing defense was burnt out, contrary to last year. Dorian Finney-Smith leaves for Brooklyn, and the team was just not as interconnected from a communication standpoint on defense. Dwight suffered very heavily with that sort of agenda in mind. And, when the Mavericks, having to play more man, him having to just kind of play straight up on some guys, that obviously hurt. But, barring just from the sort of change from playing less zone, which was, maybe marginal at best, the Mavericks just as a team were funneling a lot more guys to their big men. And, Dwight was tasked to be a tried and true rim protector at times, which he simply just does not have the verticality if you combined his wingspan with his size and just the positioning to really be able to withstand for prolonged periods in the game. And that's why, we saw him subsequently have to exit games at times. But, just obviously that, and then, when the Mavericks, who I would say were not switch heavy, but they switched a decently, like probably a moderate amount of times comparatively to most NBA teams. Dwight obviously was tasked with having to get on smaller guys a lot too, as he has in years previous. And, you can maybe argue he got beat to the basket a little more than he usually does from that perspective. Just a little, less quick to flip his hips. Maybe the athleticism waned just a tad this year. It wasn't anything that was increasingly noticeable, but I would definitely say, as a fan that watches basically almost every game, that, there were maybe a few lobs that were there with him and Luka that, you saw Luka defer and maybe pass back out because he didn't have as much confidence in Dwight being able to finish a play that he may have been able to do pre-ACL or pre-Achilles for that matter. Or, there were some plays that he was missing dunks at points earlier in the season quite a bit. So, those are all sort of limitations upon his game. But then, at the end of the day, you have this guy who's, extremely energetic and always ready to do whatever the team needs and hustle really hard. So, it's an interesting sort of dichotomy when you're looking at just the, aspects of his game, of course. But I would definitely just agree in general that he's probably marginally more ineffective than he was maybe the last 2 years. But, a lot of it can be attributed to the position that he's being put in, having to play against these starting centers night in and night out, as well as, maybe a little bit of athleticism waning with age. So, I think that those are all factors in terms of why this guy sort of is where he is at the moment. But nonetheless, I don't think that he's burnt out or that he doesn't have a role in the NBA anymore. Like I don't think there's really any credence to that. He can still definitely be a good mentor for younger centers on a roster, or just a great team contributor, and be a guy that when you need just some rim pressure to be thrusted upon in a given game, and you're just feeling like you don't have enough. I wouldn't say size, but you just don't have enough actions going towards the rim, and you feel like the 3-point shot's not falling to an extent. If the Mavericks were able to mend their center situation next year, I would be remiss to say that I don't think Dwight Powell could still come in and provide a valuable, 10 to 15 minutes on a given night, just depending on the matchup. So that's my brief, or not too brief, sort of synopsis on his just past regular season in terms of his strengths and weaknesses. I would definitely tend to agree with you on most of the stuff that you said there. I think we kind of touched up on all this, so we can kind of tread through this fairly fast here. But just briefly, what do you think his biggest improvement was? Because we're doing this for all of our season review podcast, what do you think Dwight's biggest improvement was from the 2021 to 22 year?
I think, this is kind of hard looking at it from an X's and O's point of view. Outside of more of an effort view, like the thing that comes to mind for me is just effort. He's always been an effort motor guy. But yeah, I think, effort is probably the biggest thing that comes to me. I think that there was multiple possessions, on the offensive glass that were, especially as the season later kind of went along, he became a better offensive rebounder. And it wasn't more so that he, offensive rebounder. It's just he became a better sort of, keeping the ball alive guy. And I think that's all conducive to effort. It consistently would go up, on balls that were 50-50 balls, and, tip it out to either Luka or Kyrie, and it would create a second chance. I think that's probably the biggest, my improvement, because I think from an X's and O's point of view, again, I think it's kind of hard to look at for Dwight Powell. But I think, from a motor perspective, from an energy perspective, I think that's probably the biggest improvement that I think I've seen, is just his energy, keeping the balls alive. He's not been the best rebounder throughout his career. So I think getting him available, and, I think he averaged 4 rebounds, I think is what I said. I think that's a good stat for him.
Yeah, no, I think he did a little bit better from a rebounding and effort perspective as well. And did he actually do better, or was that just amplified by, the stark contrast in effort team wide from the 2022 Mavericks to the 2023 Mavericks? There could definitely be an argument that's made there, because, Dwight's effort may have been sort of thrust upon a dimmer light when everybody on the team was giving a lot more effort in that 2021-2022 season. But, I definitely, he was always up cheering for the team, regardless of if, it was JaVale or Christian Wood, playing in his spot ahead of him. He's an uber energetic guy. And I do feel as if that he, had instances this year where he was trying to invigorate a sort of fire into this team, in out of timeout scenarios or out of the half, when, some of those offensive rebounds, it didn't always really come into fruition in the long run. But, maybe he did view himself a little bit more as a sort of spark plug guy that, needed to bring that energy to the team. So, if I had to pinpoint anything, I guess the sort of marginal increase in effort is definitely something I could maybe attribute it to. What do you think would be the best thing for Dwight, if he's coming back with the Mavericks next year? What is the biggest thing that he needs to improve upon? And, as a prerequisite with this, just given that we have this sort of stark contrast between younger and older players, we're going to be realistic with the older players. If you go back and listen to our pod with Davis Bertans, Justin Holiday, and Markieff Morris, we weren't saying that, they could improve upon things in their game that they just necessarily couldn't. We didn't think Davis was going to become a, gaudy defender all of a sudden, but, conversely, there are, certain marginal things that even guys that, their age can still improve upon. So we wanted to, make sure that the inclusion of this part of the whole season review thing was in there, even for younger and older players alike. So, Jaren, if you had to pinpoint one thing that Dwight Powell could get better at to be better in the 2023-2024 season, what would it be?
For me, I think it would be switchability. I think one of his biggest flaws as the 2022-2023 season kind of kicked along was this, just how unswitchable he was. He became almost like a saloon door when switched on smaller defenders. So I think if he could work on his hips, work on his sort of front to front defense, man on man defense, if you will, like I think that's probably the biggest thing he could improve upon, to see the floor a little bit more. I just don't see a role on this team where, he's going to be the number one center again. So I think if he could improve upon just sort of like the switchability.
We say that every year.
We do say this every year, and it happens time and time again, but hopefully this is the year where he's not our number one center. But I think if he could become more of a weak side, sort of switchable guy, that would really improve upon his defense. And, he is an older guy, you just said your disclaimer. So if that's possible because of his waning age, I'm not, 100% not sure. But I think, if he could improve upon his hip movement, his hip mobility, that would probably be the most beneficial, especially on the defensive side of things for his career.
Yeah, I think we saw flashes of it at the beginning of the season. Like, he's still not the rim protector that we will really ever, tend to, view him as like that. That's never really going to be something that comes into fruition. But I think earlier in the season, we did see, an increased mobility of sorts from him when he got switched to the perimeter. And I think that just the gruesome nature of the NBA season kind of caught up to him. And we saw him get blown by more as the season kind of went along, in a more limited role where he's against some of these, centers off the bench and, forwards and guards off the bench. I do think that he could probably play a little bit, just better perimeter defense, when he does get involved in those pick and roll scenarios. There's a lot of times that he was in the pick and roll and that, just because of the lack of size there, the Mavericks would try to run sort of wonky stuff with him at the point of attack where they'd have him hedge and recover. And, by that time, his man was already like 1 foot deep in the basket. So a lot of that is also sort of schematic too, just once he's playing against, smaller centers, he may not have to have such aggressive upfront coverage to where, if you have a guy that's able to make that pass over the top of him, he's basically toast and that's an easy basket. You can have Dwight, stay in position, down the dunker spot a little bit more, drop him against more slower footed centers so long as they're not like towering over him. Because, we do see a lot of smaller centers typically coming off the bench. So, there's some different things that they can do there. So, I think that that's a good one. I would go with rebounding. I think that he is a stronger guy and, he's tall, obviously. He's 6'10", just even though he doesn't have the most insane wingspan, but, I think he could just use his body a little bit more and his strength as his career progresses because he is a stronger guy and he has a good lower body and upper body base. To be able to get a few more boards because he has the archetype to be able to do that. Defensively, while he is fast, he doesn't have the longest arms. We can cut him some slack there. He obviously has just never had the most diverse array of an offensive portfolio, but rebounding, he has the tools to do it. He just, is a pretty decent offensive rebounder, but then for whatever reason, not the best defensive rebounder. So I think that that's an area that he could improve upon. And I think it's more so just technique based for him, boxing out and understanding angles in terms of where the ball is going to come off versus anything to do with effort because, he still dives for every loose ball and everything like that. So that would be mine. Jaren, what do you give Dwight, or what do you think Dwight Powell's sustainability rating is as a Maverick out of 10 going forward here?
As a Maverick, I don't know what our highest is. I think it's like a 7. I think Jaden Hardy got like a 7. So I'm going to put Dwight probably at like a 6 because, I do think that there is a possibility he's probably on a different team this offseason, but I do think that there's a higher possibility that he's in a Mavericks uniform. And if all goes right, he will finally not be the Mavericks number one center. He will actually be on the bench, which is what we have been pining for like 4 or 5 years now. So I think, I think if, we can bring him back on a minimum or a shorter, longer deal contract, I would be open to that. And I do think that's probably more of a possibility this offseason than anything else. So I would put it at a 6. I think it's probably, it leaves room for him being somewhere else, but also it's like enough of a percentage to probably that he's going to stay in Dallas.
No, yeah, for sure. I would definitely agree with you. Like straight up 6. And you hit the nail on the head in terms of your argument there. In terms of the interesting stat that we're doing for every player, I know I kind of incidentally reverse the order there with the sustainability rating coming first, but nonetheless, I did the interesting stat for Dwight Powell in this one. And as the, his sort of cliche stat that Mavericks fans are very keen to, time in and time out, year in and year out, they sort of cling to this Dwight Powell stat. And, it's his points per possession as the roll man. How good is Dwight Powell as the roll man? What percentile is he in this nature? And as the roll man, with 1.6 possessions typically as the roll man per game, a frequency of 28.9%, meaning that Dwight Powell, when he's in the game, he gets a pick. He's the roll man 28.9% of the time. He was in the 93rd.8 percentile of all roll man in the pick and roll game. Jaren obviously alluded to that earlier in the podcast.
I think I messed up. I think I said 80th percentile.
Oh, no, you're fine. Among players that have at least one possession as the roll man in the game, Dwight Powell, according to Synergy and NBA.com, ranked, let's see, he would have ranked 4th in the NBA in terms of players that have one possession as the roll man in the or higher in the game. And, just the guys that are even above him are going to be James Wiseman, DeAndre Jordan, and is that it? No, I think he's actually 3rd. That was my mistake. He's actually 3rd. So clearly just James Wiseman and DeAndre Jordan. And these are guys who, don't really even play near as much as him. And, Wiseman was obviously kind of plagued with injuries all year and transferring from the Warriors to the Pistons. So that's kind of an albatross in itself. So, I mean, he still kind of holds the title of best roller in the NBA. But, I think Mavs fans will also ask how much of that is due to Luka Doncic, which is obviously, I think more of attributed to Luka and how uber talented he is and his ability to set up Dwight. But, even before Luka, Dwight was still no shill in terms of his ability to roll to the basket. So, I know that that's the stat that's sort of, ran year in and year out for him, kind of just in Mavs land. But, we still want to shine a light upon the positive things he do, because I think people have a tendency to just label him as this, they get frustrated with the role that he's playing, even though it's not necessarily his fault. And they take it, strictly all out on him, which, over at the Mainstream Mavs podcast, we don't discriminate. We want to make sure that you guys get the full story. And we thought that narrative wasn't fair. So for all those in the Dwight Powell fan club, you can't say that we didn't do anything for you. So there you go. Jaren.
It was our one thing that we did this season for Dwight
Powell.
Yeah,
so it was our one thing that we did this season. Do we want to get into the whole situation with Dwight Powell and in the minutes that he played this year over Christian Wood, or would you like to reserve that for the Christian Wood podcast in itself? Because that will be a whole podcast and just getting into the situation of why Dwight Powell ended up playing more.
I say we reserve this for the Christian Wood podcast, because I do think that we have the plan of Christian Wood being a whole separate player profile in itself. I think we're just going to stick Christian Wood by himself on one profile or on one podcast. So I think that we could probably just knock it down to that. But I mean, I think it's more of a Christian Wood problem in my eyes. I think that's, whenever you talk
Dwight
about
Powell
that,
just being
about Christian Wood,
the savvy veteran, just in there to do his job. He could care less about how many minutes.
He's not at blame. He's not at blame. Dwight's not at blame. So
no, exactly. I love Dwight Powell. That's all I got to say.
We love Dwight Powell in the Mainstream Mavs podcast.
Nonetheless, Jaren, would you like to segue us into the season interview for Mr. Frank Ntilikina, the French Prince of Bel-Air, per se?
Yeah, let's get into the French Prince. So in 47 games played, he played 13 minutes per game. averaged a billing 3 points per game, 36% from the field, 25% from the 3-point line, 66% from the free throw line, averaged a rebound and assist. Will, these abysmal field goal percentage and 3-point percentage, what do you take to that? Because I think I didn't know that it was that bad. So
I didn't either, Jaren. I didn't either. That is pretty bad, albeit Frank had a somewhat limited role this season that was a little more even and consistent maybe than last year's, due to the ascension of Jaden Hardy, more so late in the season. And then, just the whole Mavericks weird log jam at guard and then non-log jam. I mean, it was just a weird sort of situation for him all year, and he had inconsistent minutes. I think that there was times that the fan base was actually pining for him to get a little bit more run when he actually has some of those late season performances where he showed out a little bit. And then I think early on in the season, he was looked at as a guy who should be going to play in the CBA, the Chinese Basketball Association. So I think that fans definitely had deferring interest throughout certain points of the year in terms of how good Frank was and how much he could, readily contribute to the team. I do think that there was some sort of recency bias going into the season, just kind of due to the fact of how he played in that Phoenix series, being able to sort of tit for tat guard Devin Booker, be an excellent screen navigator throughout that series. He was part of the reason that the Mavericks, defense was able to bolster itself up so well, and the Mavericks were able to get to the Western Conference Finals. So I do think that there was something to that effect that, you wanted some more defense out there, but the team was, at such a pure lack of ball handling that Frank, himself was probably going to have to be tasked to do some of that. And we talked about that early on in some of our offseason podcasts, who would rise up between Frank and Josh Green. And that obviously kind of seems like silly, looking back at that now. But I mean, to Frank's credit, he, really did come in and at least put his best foot forward. And, he definitely felt like the effort was there. I just think we saw early on that his role as a primary, or not necessarily even a primary ball handler, but even like a tertiary ball handler was negligible at best, just because of, his inability to create space and create a shot for himself in any capacity and make the defense respect him to where he could operate within the pick and roll. But as the season got on, we saw him do a few of those things at the end of the year, despite the abysmal field goal percentages that you alluded to. So it was a weird season from him, and there was this weird sort of glimpse of hope at the end. But he's been in the NBA since he was 18. He's a 6-year veteran at this point, which sounds kind of crazy to say, but at the same time, he's only 24. So you're looking at a younger guy here who could still maybe bear some development. But the question is that development going to be in the NBA or in the CBA? So, I'm not necessarily saying he's going to be in the CBA. I think he is definitely in the G League or the Euro League before he bears that sort of, he's relegated to that point. But I do think that it's just a weird sort of, he's a very, juxtaposed player, because we see these times where, he looks like he could be this sort of tertiary ball handler, and a guy who's able to defend 1 through 2 really well and be a great point of attack defender. And then there's times that, those small glimpses of hope just simply cannot make up for the absolute just non-contribution that he kind of puts forward on the offensive end. So in conclusion, I know there's a long spiel for Frank the Tank, but there were some expectations for him coming into the season, hence why he's in this podcast, not the last one. And they didn't, I would say that, they definitively were not met, but he did have some weird glimpses towards the end of the season that might just make him, might just be enough for Jason Kidd to say F it and throw him back on a, give him a training camp invite and, see where it leads. So, he could be back on the team. He could not. That's something that we'll have to kind of microanalyze as we get into the sort of dog days of the off season. There's nothing to talk about. I could definitely see, I've seen enough to where I think he still, probably has at least one more year of, or at least a few games of a year to be, to exemplify his sort of skill set on the NBA roster. But, there is a certain shelf life there associated with that if he's not able to do that. So it'll be interesting to see what his role is like going forward.
Yeah, I think, from a 10th or 11th man spot on the roster, there was a lot of headlines surrounding him. Was he taking minutes from Jaden Hardy? Is he really worthy of an NBA spot? Like, I think that there was a lot of questions surrounding his sort of role on this team. There was some weird glimpses throughout the season where I think he was, either becoming a decent facilitator, a tertiary ball handler, someone you could somewhat rely upon on, depending on the game or matchup. And then there was, especially late in the season, he came on as a sort of corner shooter. He actually started knocking down more 3-point shots at a high volume, or not really at a high volume, I should say, but
A low
at
volume.
a good volume for his book. So I think, there was just a lot of weird sort of headlines that surrounded his game, and surrounded really his season for that matter. So, I do think that there's a lot of things that he can improve upon because at the end of the day, he is 24. I think there's still a lot more room for development. Athletically, he's just, tapping into his quote unquote prime self. So I think if you're going to see the best version of him, it'll have to be soon. And that's saying a lot due to, the fact that he could possibly not be on an NBA roster come this time next year. But, even so.
No, yeah. I mean, I hate to interrupt you, but I was just going to say, you brought up some really good stuff. And I mean, with this player, I really think that he is the type of guy that we could be, seeing taking a really sizable jump into, his role in the league, whether that's on the Mavericks or with somebody else. He's a guy who could be one of those just late bloomers, maybe, i.e. like a Danny Green, who kind of came along in his mid-20s. I know it's a different career path. He was in the G League for a while, but I mean, Frank's one of those guys who maybe he just didn't, stay in France long enough. I don't know if that's like harsh to say, but that could have been the instance. And, he just needed a little bit more time to develop some of those skill sets. I have a really weird sort of prediction for Frank because I just see his career path going one of two ways. I don't know if this is some sort of, just inherent sort of bias that I've built upon myself, but I kind of see just out of nowhere in the next year or two, him evolving into a sort of DeAnthony Melton-esque guy.
But that's after he's a Maverick.
Yeah, I mean, it'll probably be knowing our luck, yes. But I mean, if the development and everything were to go right, I mean, I think that, he doesn't have that star potential that he used to. That's definitely overcast, but I still think he has the just physical tools to be a really good role player, just given his length and his lateral quickness. But, if things go haywire, he could be out of the league. Like, I don't know, for some reason, I just view this as two extremities on each side of the totem pole with Frank. He's just one of those type of players that doesn't strike me as a guy that's going to just stay in this sort of reserve 10 to 15 role for the rest of his career. It's going to either be out of the league or, he really blossoms into an integral role player for a good team. So that's going to be an interesting dynamic to see going forward nonetheless. But there's really no way of actually predicting, what exactly is going to happen in terms of that Frank scenario. So that's all just kind of based on my own sort of suspicion. So we'll just have to see what happens with that in regards to his role. But I have some outlandish sideways sort of optimism that things could go the right way. But that probably, if we're categorizing it, that's probably about 10% of my energy towards Frank Ntilikina, and the other 90% is probably just overt pessimism and thinking that he is probably not an NBA player, but he at least shows flashes. So we'll have to see what happens with that. But he did have a fairly interesting season last year. Jaren, what do you think Frank improved upon the most from his 2021 21-22 campaign with the Mavericks, to contrary to this last season with the Mavericks?
See, now that's hard to answer. That's a hard question to answer, just because the volume at which we saw him play we just didn't really see enough of it. I would say, from a ball handling perspective, I think we saw probably the biggest improvements. We didn't really see him do too much from a ball handling perspective in the 21-22 campaign. So I can't really say, that we saw too much from that. Again, it was very, very spotty this year, but I do think that, there was glimpses, there was stints of multiple games on in that, you could see the progression being made, especially as the season went along. You saw it more common, and that shooting, occur more common, or at least is like sort of hot streaks, quote unquote, more common. So I think, from that perspective, I would probably say it was his ball handling, and that's saying a lot because, again, that's something that is, very uncommon for him. But still, I do think that he's improved upon in that, and his facilitating, I do think was probably about average this year. I don't think we saw anything too special. He was sort of, basically another ball mover, similar to what Spencer did when he was, in his time in Dallas, at least this season. So I think for the biggest improvement that I saw would probably be ball handling. I just think that there wasn't anything from an offensive perspective that he would open up or create, but I do think at times, really, Memphis game kind of sticks out to me, maybe a few others, where he was able to, kind of be someone that you had to look out for, someone that you actually had to, defend or at least keep an open eye on. So I think from that perspective, I would say ball handling.
Yeah. In the same vein with that, I mean, I would just say like dribble penetration and the ability to get the ball to the dunker spot. There were some times where he attacked off closeouts and he was able to convert some easy lobs to some guys and pop a few floaters that went in. He had a few more tough finishes from this year, so I think that whole just ball handling and just finishing prerogative in itself is probably what I would say was his biggest improvement, for sure. What do you think he has to do to really open up his game as a Dallas Maverick, and like what do you see and like what is his role as an NBA player if he's to ever improve marginally upon multiple areas of his game to the point where it actually adds up to him being a decent role player in this league? What does that look like if you, even if you want to like give a 1-for-1 comparison or anything? What does that look like, and what does he have to improve upon?
Yeah, I'm not really, too sure if there's a 1-for-1 improvement. I think, if he could become a sort of 3-and-D ball facilitator, I think that'd probably be in his best interest, or, someone along the lines of that, because, we were teeter-tottering around the line of, is this guy a facilitator? Because, again, at the end of the day, he was asked in the beginning of the season to be, one of those tertiary ball handlers. So, we were sort of questioning, is this guy a tertiary ball handler, or is this guy sort of, a wing? Like what does he bring to this team? What is he? So I think if he could find a more defined role, and that being, sort of someone who can facilitate and also, knock down the corner threes whenever the guys like Kyrie or Luka are on the floor. I think if he becomes someone like that, I don't really think there's much to question defensively. I think the defense, has a good baseline there. I do think, at certain points we saw a drop off. But for me, I think it's finding a fine line of, who he is, what kind of role he wants to bring. Cause, again, there was sort of two players on the floor that we saw from Frank Ntilikina, whether it was the wing or facilitating. So I think if he could find a fine line of that, improve upon, what he thinks, or what he wants his role to be, I think that'd probably be in his best interest. And like I said, I think, for him to move on and become, a better, or at least a more sustainable NBA player, I think it's, improving upon his ball handling and, of course, adding some shot making to that as well.
No, 100%. I would definitely agree with you in terms of the certain things that he has to improve from that perspective. What do you think his, sustainability is as a Maverick going forward, if you had to grade it on a scale from 1 to 10?
We'll go with a nice 3 out of 10. I do see a world where, he could possibly be on the Mavericks through the summer. And maybe we sign him to, a minimum contract. I do think he qualifies for a vet minimum. I do think there is a world where that exists, and but going forward, can he last a full 82 games on a roster? That's where I start to bear the question, and that's why I would list him as a 3, is because I simply right now where he is in his game, I just don't think that, or where he is at his career, I don't think that he's a guy that can last a full season on a team, on an NBA roster for that matter, no matter where the spot is. So I think for him to be a Maverick, he needs to again find a defined role and really know his identity, know what he wants to become in a basketball player. So I'm leaning more on the pessimistic side. I think if you want to take Will's 10% of the D'Anthony Melton route, you have to bump those numbers up, but I'm going to go with a 3 out of 10.
Yeah, no, I think that that's pretty realistic. Just because I'm the brigade leader of the tank, and that kind of goes hand in hand with Frank the Tank. I'm gonna have to up it to a 4 out of 10, just because I'm writing it out for Frank the Tank and his ability to lead the brigade as he did it at the end of the season there as the Mavericks were tanking. But no, in all seriousness, I do think that he could easily be brought back on a smaller deal, even if it's just a last ditch kind of thing, filling out the back half of your roster. And then in terms of his routes getting minutes after that, it's going to be all conducive to how he performs in practice and training camp, and how much preparation he took this offseason, because if he is as good as he is this year, next year, then he's gonna see his role not be all too dissimilar to what it was. So that'll be an interesting thing to iron out as we go forward. I do think that there's an alternative world where he is a Maverick, but I would definitely say that there's definitely a higher percentage that there's an alternative world where he is not a Maverick, if I had to guess, just given the sort of overhaul that this team seems to be prepping to do on all sorts of levels. I don't know how much sustainability I give to any of those free agents that are going to be surefire unrestricted free agents, even the beautiful Dwight Powells of the world. So we'll have to see what happens in that department. But Jaren, I know you took pride in the fact that you did Frank's special stat. So if you wanted to go ahead and relay over that to all of our listeners before we move on to JaVale Pierre McGee, then I think you would be more than inclined to do so.
Yeah, I took a really serious approach whenever I got this assignment thrown my way. Through Frank Ntilikina's career, he averaged, or I don't know about average, but this season he had a 12.5% usage rate, and that would land him at a career worst in terms of the usage rate, which I think only speaks to what kind of season he's had. So I think that's probably the best sort of stat that you could pull for the French Prince Bel-Air sort of scene, and what kind of season he had. Yeah,
no, that's interesting because almost it looked like he had the ball in his hands more, but he played so little that these are hard to do with some of the sample size. With a guy like Frank, it's just kind of hard to pinpoint with a guy who plays that little of games and stuff like that, just due to DNPCDs and the injuries he was dealing with. But I think that that's about as good of a dig as you could have found. So I commend you for finding that stat. It definitely is emblematic of that steep decline he just sort of took in terms of like when he was in the game. In those beginning months of the season, he was just relegated to being in the corner until we finally saw him open up a little of his game towards the end of the year. So that's a good dig for sure. If we want to start on JaVale McGee, Jaren, this was obviously the guy that the Mavericks signed with the taxpayer mid-level exception last year, or they consolidated most of it to him, and then the about 1/6 of it or so to Jaden Hardy. JaVale was signed to a 3-year contract after a pretty good season as the backup center for the Phoenix Suns behind DeAndre Ayton. We saw him have some decent performances in that playoff series versus the Mavericks, of course, last year that, we've obviously touted as the only good thing to happen in this franchise in the last 36 months. So, we have that, and JaVale comes in, he's 34, 35, but just given how sustainable his athleticism has been these last few years, I think most, people question the signing, especially the dollar amount and the years. But I do think that there was this sort of sense of optimism that the Mavericks at least got a pseudo rim protector to be able to help them through a solid 15 to 20 minutes throughout the game. JaVale just proved too inconsistent in that manner, both offensively and defensively. We saw a lot of flashes. We didn't see a lot of any, rim protection or dynamic role threat on a consistent basis. And, we knew that he wasn't going to be coming in and doing this for long stretches of the game, but I think a lot of Mavericks fans thought that he would at least still have solid games, every 2 nights or so in a limited role capacity, playing about 15, 20 minutes a game. The Mavericks, that was, basically their primary signing over the offseason. That didn't come into fruition. We saw pretty quickly that JaVale, he did decent more so towards the end of the season, but, early on in the season, we saw some early season woes that were just sort of irrefutable in terms of, us wanting, or Jason Kidd or the fan base for that matter. They were irrefutable from the perspective that you didn't even want to see him on the court. So what do you attribute to that? And what do you think were some of his biggest strengths and weaknesses this year?
So real quick before I answer that, I'll just name off his sort of counting stats. In 42 games played, he averaged 8.5 minutes per game, 4.5 points per game, 64% from the field. And some of his more notable stats were 2 assists and 0.6 blocks, which would land him a career worst since the 2014-15 season, where he only played 6 games for the Philadelphia 76ers. I think what kind of led to his sort of shortcomings was just, I don't know if he came into the season out of shape or just, expecting too much, just kind of got caught up in the fact that he would become a starting center. Because again, if you remember, if you put yourself back, this time, or not this time a year ago, but, just about 10 months ago, the reason why he came to Dallas is because he was promised a starting role. And that's kind of why he signed here instead of Milwaukee. And very quickly, I think, 5-10 games in, we realized that was not going to be the case. And his starting role and really his role in the season was pretty much just redacted from that point on. We barely saw him from the beginning of the season pretty much until like game 40, I think is where he got like a short little stint. And then after that, we kind of saw him a little bit more here and there. But I think, for me, it was, again, I don't know if he came into camp out of shape, just expecting too much and, kind of lost his role, but he was just a really bad basketball player. I think that's kind of the best way to put it. What we expected out of JaVale from a floor base level, I think was nothing that we thought we would get. We thought, at worst, he was going to be a guy that could plug you in for a solid 10 to 15 minutes a game and give you, the at least a decent amount of rim protecting and rim rolling, but that we saw none of that. The rim rolling side of things, he was just very spotty. I think is probably the best way to put it. That was at least his one positive throughout the year on offense. And then defensively, just being caught out of place. Through the defensive side of things, I don't think that he was very high IQ minded whenever it came to the Mavericks side of defense. I think, he was just caught out of place. Didn't really know who he was on the floor at all times, was constantly allowing guys easy buckets, or just, whenever he was switched one-on-one, one guy who I can think of that pretty much just exploited every single mismatch that he got was Jose Alvarado early on in that Pelicans matchup. He put up a quick 15 on JaVale. And yeah, I think that pretty much just set the tide for what the season would become for JaVale McGee. So I think that, just from a basketball player standpoint, he just wasn't that. And his age definitely showed. We saw him pretty much just become a good, backup center in Phoenix. And then in Dallas, he was promised that starting role, and it became nothing that we thought he would be.
Yeah, no, 100%. And, just really late to react on a lot of those defensive possessions when he was tasked, to be a rim protector, or he was, switched onto a smaller player. And, from an offensive perspective, he just, he had some sort of errant hands. He made some just weird mistakes when he had a guy sealed, or, he, had the opportunity to, go up for an easy dunk. He would pass out of it at times, and then sometimes he would take some questionable shots, and when he would get a post up, and maybe not the best of position. So it was just a sort of clunky fit from both sides. And what do you attribute to the whole JaVale being promised a starting role? How do you think that came into fruition? Who do you think was the catalyst in terms of leading that sort of agenda?
Yeah, I think, you have to look at, pretty much who's in the room whenever he signed that contract. Definitely Jason Kidd. I think he played a part in that, being that, he was an assistant coach in Los Angeles where, again, JaVale won a championship and had a pretty big role. At least in the regular season. I think, throughout the playoffs, his role sort of diminished. But yeah, I mean, I think being that, he was a familiar guy with Jason Kidd's game and with what, he wanted to see on the floor, I think that pretty much gave him, a sensibility that of like comfortability. I think that's probably the best way to put it. I think that's pretty much why he was promised a starting role. There wasn't another guy on this roster who could do the things that he could have done, which is becoming that, rim rolling, sort of rim protecting big. We just simply didn't have that. We had the rim rolling part, but we never had the rim protecting part. So I think, from that perspective, defensively, that played a big part in it. And especially in the playoffs, the Mavericks were so deprived of that sort of rim protecting big that, we wanted to aid that problem now. And that's why signing JaVale McGee was probably the quote unquote best thing to do at the time. And that came back and pretty much just shot us right in the face. But I think that was probably a mixture of it. And, again, I don't know if he came into camp or into the season out of shape or just unconfident. I don't really know what it was. I do think it was a mental thing, or at least like a physical thing, being, out of shape, whatever it was. But there's just too many sort of, non-basketball player factors, I think, that go into this. That's kind of hard to answer that question.
What do you think happened with his whole, I wouldn't call it a revitalization, but he had this weird sort of midseason turnaround where he was still being granted those very limited opportunities. But, on nights where Maxey needed a rest night after, he had to start rehabilitating that hamstring more upon his return. And, just nights where the Mavericks big man rotation was a little thinner. We saw JaVale get some run, and he honestly performed, fairly well in some of these games. And, we know that he apparently had some sort of mental shift after the Kyrie trade, was like a little more, hyped about the team or whatever. He's always, leading the pregame hype circle right outside the tunnel and stuff like that. What do you think anything changed? And do you think the Mavericks should have tried to play him more once he started to, get that on-court fit a little bit? We know earlier in the season, just due to some of his interviews, that, he attributed some of the clunky defensive and lackluster defensive play from him due to the Mavericks switching more in their system, contrary to what he had previously done. But, Golden State, I would argue, switches quite a bit. He's played over there. I can't speak too much for the Lakers, I guess, and the Suns maybe didn't switch as much. But I mean, I don't know. It's a weird sort of argument, but he attributed that to some of his lackluster defensive possessions and, just some of the slow reactivity. Do you think that, he ever got to a point in the regular season, when he got a few cracks at the apple, that he played well enough to actually warrant another shot in the rotation? Or do you think it was just late or too late in the season and it was negligible in terms of the impact it would actually have on winning at best?
Yeah, I think, definitely what turned it around for him, mentally and physically in this, throughout the season was probably the Kyrie trade. You can notice, a sort of not a sense of like being sorry, but like him actually wanting to produce something on the floor. So I think that's probably the biggest switch in his head that happened throughout the season. I do, me personally, I think that there's arguments to be made here, but me personally, I do think that there was a role on this team later in the season, and we saw him sort of, revitalize, get some more minutes here and there. But even still, I don't think, it was enough to warrant a starting role or a backup center role, ahead of Maxey. But I still do think that, you could have warranted probably like 15 minutes a game, given him a little bit of a bigger role where he's playing alongside Luka and Kyrie. And I don't think that we saw that at really any point throughout the end of the season. So I think if, there's one thing that we could have done different throughout at least the end of the season was probably play him more with Kyrie, more with Luka. Because I do think, his most productive minutes were along with those guys. But yeah, just from like mentally what switched, I do think it was that Kyrie trade.
Yeah, I mean, I would have liked to see his fit next to Christian Wood a little bit more too, because even earlier in the season, that was never something that was particularly showcased. It was always one big on, one big off, and then they played that lineup a few times toward the end of the season, and it honestly like wasn't too bad just from a sheer size perspective. Even if they were kind of some Dumbledores on the Mavericks, in terms of their defensive rebounding. We saw this team late in the year just routinely just not even give, I excuse my language, but not even give like a rat's ass to try and go get the rebound. But then, I think just that sheer amount of size between, maybe Christian Wood and JaVale at the same time would have helped them a little bit more. And, JaVale just being a little bit more reactive, who knows? But I think we can both agree that, just due to the early season struggles and even late in the season, we still saw the inconsistencies arise every once in a while. That the Mavericks did not get what they signed up for, and JaVale's impact on winning probably wouldn't have, forwarded the team into, any higher position than where they're at. Maybe they win another game or two or something. So who knows what actually happens, but I'm sure it could have mended the situation a little bit. But now that we've kind of gone over the strengths and weaknesses from JaVale this past year and talked about just kind of his standing on the team and everything that led to his signing and that whole weird promise of the starting role. What do you think his biggest improvement was from his previous year in Phoenix? This is going to be a dig for you, Jaren, but we got to follow the format on these season in review. So what do you think it is if you had to guess?
We'll go with leadership.
Yeah, he was tasked to be a little bit of a veteran leader on this team.
Yeah, we'll go with leadership. I did notice that, he did take accountability and, coaching up Jaden Hardy, or at least being alongside him on the bench and, giving him a heads up or a talking to, whatever it was. And again, he led the halftime huddle or the halftime hype huddle, whatever you want to call it, or not halftime, just like locker room huddle, whatever it is. He was the guy to be in the middle of that. And he was the guy to sort of, get this team excited for a total of 38 wins or 36. I forget how many they lost, or won. But yeah, he was the guy to be tasked in doing that. So I think, out of all of the negatives that JaVale McGee has had this season, I would say that's definitely one of the more positives. Again, I don't know what he was tasked with, from a leadership perspective or what he did from a leadership perspective in LA or in Phoenix. But, from what I saw in Dallas, through all the negatives that were going on, I think that's one thing that he at least took pride in and took accountability in. And that's, again, I do have to give him props for that.
Yeah. I would say, if I'm just going to BS an on-court thing that he did better, I would just say his finishing out of the high post when JaVale would do his little shimmy, and every once in a while he'd just throw one of those hook shots up there. I'm just going to guess that maybe a few of those went in more, and a few of those went in a little bit more in Dallas than they did in Phoenix. Because late in the season, like he actually had a little bit of touch when it came to that shot. Every time you got like the ball at the mid post and he was going to do like a turnaround hook shot, I'd be remiss to say that I didn't have some sort of outlying confidence that he was just going to somehow, it was going to hit the rim about 8 times and then drop in. So that's kind of how those tended to go. So that's what I would probably say if I just had to pick something. But it's hard in that department. I don't think JaVale necessarily lost a ton of his athleticism. Like you said, I just think a lot of it was just very IQ related and very just like reactivity based, just not, being in the right presence of mind and knowing where he was on the court. So what do you think the biggest improvement that he could make going into year whatever? I'm pretty sure his age 36 year in the NBA.
Yeah, I think he's around there. I think, again, this is hard to make these for these sort of veteran older players. But for me, I think the biggest sort of improvement he can make is just being more efficient, more responsive on the defensive side of things, maybe understanding assignments more, or just, being more responsive on the sort of like weak side blocking. Cause, we didn't really get to see him one-on-one too much up until like later in the season, where he was matched up on like the sort of bigger centers. Again, it's like the fifth time I mentioned like Embiid in this podcast, but we never really got to see him get matched up against the Embiids or Jokic's of the world throughout the season. So I think if we could see a little bit more consistency, finding a role on defense, knowing where he is, plugging and playing, and the things that we know he can do, I think that's probably the best thing that would, be for him. Because athletically, I do know that, there was a very little, if anything, of a drop off athletically. But I do think, it is getting to the time in his career where we're going to start to notice those things. So I think if you could figure out from a mental perspective, or at least being in the right place at right time, defensively, I think if he could figure that out more so than anything, I think that'd probably benefit him the most.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you from that perspective. Despite the contract figure not being idealistic and him probably needing to be on a minimum and, coming off the bench, I think that's irrefutable after this season. If he were to improve on those things, he could still be a capable backup center. And I mean, it goes without saying, even just, who knows how many years he has left just given his age and the potential waning athleticism. But I would tend to agree with you. Jaren, you were tasked as well with coming up with a stat for JaVale McGee. What did you end up coming up with for his special stat on the season?
Yeah, so with a baseline of 10 games played, because Tyler Dorsey and Chris Silva, if we remember his time in Dallas, rest in peace. Not actually rest in peace, but with a minimum of 10 games played, JaVale McGee came in second on the team in shooting efficiency, only behind Dwight Powell. He shot an efficient 65% from the field. Now, given, Luka, Kyrie, they shot much higher volume. Josh Green, all these guys, they shot a much higher volume, and thus their numbers were just naturally going to drop. But, in what he did and what Dwight Powell did, he landed second with 65%.
Yeah, and I mean, it goes without saying that I feel like all those attempts are basically at the rim. So
yeah, exactly.
So that's a, anytime you get the
did he make a single three this year? I feel like he made one.
He made one at least.
Yeah,
I know he made one. I can't remember. It was like later in the season, but yeah, any time that you get these rolling centers, the cliche thing to do is just go for the field goal percentage stat and wow everybody with that. So that was it was an excellent find by you, Jaren.
Should we find if there was such a stat, a leadership stat?
Oh my god. yeah. That I'll tell you as much as that see Giannis Antetokounmpo, he would lead the category in the leadership stat. Just given the Bucks' recent the woes in the 2023 NBA playoffs, but that's more debatable for the national field of interest. I
didn't see it take accountability. I didn't see it take accountability.
We appeal to a niche audience. Only the mainstream Mavs listeners. We don't even watch the rest of the NBA. Jaren, do you know who Jimmy Butler is?
I don't know who Jimmy Butler is. I don't even know where Miami is. So
yeah, last I heard it's in Virginia. So it might be a fun summer trip if you're down.
Well, real quick, with the second round of the 2023 NBA playoffs approaching, who do you have? Do you have the Utah Nuggets or the Texas Suns? Who do you got winning that series?
Well, I'd be remiss to say that I don't want to rock with the hometown Suns. I'm a big Waxahachie Texas guy, and just to have a team in Waxahachie has been truly a dream come true. So I might have to rock with the Suns, but it's all going to be dependent on if Josh Okogie can take that next step in his game and go from averaging 5 made threes a game to 8. So
Josh.
Yeah. It's going to be up to that, but nonetheless, in all seriousness, my finals pick to win the championship this year is the Celtics. Jaren, you want to give yours on this podcast?
I'm gonna take Philly.
You're gonna take Philly. Wow. Okay. 2 Eastern Conference powerhouses.
They're playing.
You can see me and Jaren's sort of
butting heads
clash of clans come into fruition in this next round. But nonetheless, Jaren. Lastly, for JaVale, as we apologize to the listeners for that little satirical tangent that we just went off on. But what would you say is JaVale McGee's sustainability rating in Dallas going forward? Given that he does have, I believe, two more years on this contract remaining, with that third year being a player option. There are some different things the Mavericks could do if they really want to get rid of him. They can obviously include him in trade. They can always use that stretch wave provision to be able to, elongate that contract. The new CBA kicks in, I believe, obviously in this coming season. So I don't understand fully yet the ramifications of what that could entail in regards to JaVale McGee's, contract and stuff like that in the team. But maybe there's some provisions there that might, change that dynamic up. But what would you say is his sustainability rating on the Mavericks going forward?
Yeah, I think we're going to go with this might be a little too high, honestly. We'll go with a 5.5. Because again, his contract, is a few more years.
It's a weird contract to include in trade as well.
It's a weird contract to include in trade. It's not much of a salary filler. It's definitely more of a sweetener, if you will. That's saying a lot.
It's not a minimum deal to where, the value is, truly conducive to the player, but it's also at a fairly, smaller rate to where it's not like, just an absolute, albatross to take on if you are getting something positive in return on top of him. So it's going to depend. I do think, I'm going to go with the 4. I'm a little bit more pessimistic just given the whole Mavericks big men dilemma and how everything unfolded this season and failed so dramatically. I think they're really making a look a shift there. But, I could still see him coming back given the contract and being one of the backup centers on the Mavericks. But I will say this much, and, I think we'll get into this in some future podcasts. One of JaVale McGee and one of Dwight Powell will be off this team next year. I feel like I could say that with full confidence.
I confidently will say that. I actually agree with that.
I don't know. I mean, I just kind of came to that revelation, but I just thought of that in my head. I was like, there's no way both of them return. So I feel like I could, and if they do, then that would be very Mavericks, and I will eat my words entirely. And I will go to Mr. Cuban and we'll have some fruitful discussions as to the operation of this team. I'm just joking. We'll bring him on the podcast and we'll talk.
We love you, Mark. We love you.
We'd like to have Mark Cuban on the Mainstream Mavs podcast, but that's going to wrap it up today. Season in review for JaVale. And in Will fashion, I'm forgetting the other 2 players we did today.
Frank Ntilikina and Dwight Powell.
Frank Ntilikina and Dwight Powell. We just did the season review for them, of course. We hope you guys appreciated the podcast. It was definitely it's definitely been enlightening as we finally get through. We finally got through at least half of these season reviews, and doing this sort of back half of the roster has been enlightening, I think, from 2 perspectives. One, probably how much like I unhealthily consume the Mavericks. And then 2, probably just how bad the Mavericks are have been my sort of revelations to come from this. Just seeing as there's like not even any fringe rotation players, almost it seems. There's just a bunch of what ifs and whoever's, like it's like all these potential things and then all these just absolutely abysmal guys who were either just plagued with injuries all year or, who just simply didn't perform up to standard. But I'll say one thing about this roster. I don't think there was anybody on this roster that was as bad as the worst player on last year's roster. And I would probably say it's Sterling Brown. Like nobody unimpressed me so much that I'd say that they were Sterling Brown level. So at least this roster, they had a certain pedigree, at least, despite a bad season that they had to uphold, because 2021, 22 Sterling Brown, that was something else.
That was something else.
Yeah. Even though we weren't as covering the team as heavily, but without further ado, we will catch you guys in the next one. We appreciate you guys for listening so far. We will be back probably either tomorrow or tonight, just kind of pending on how things go, to keep hashing out these season reviews. We may not technically be doing one season review per day, but with us doing like 3 at a time, we're still kind of adhering to our promise. So we're not veering too far off track for you guys. We're still churning these out at the quota and at the threshold that we'd like, even though we did have a little bit of a gap period there for some school reasons, but we're we're still getting them all on track. We're not gonna shortchange you guys from that perspective. So we will catch you guys in the next one. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at mainstream Mav, or oh my gosh, make sure to follow us on Twitter at mainstream_Mavs. Make sure to follow us and subscribe to us on Apple Podcast or Spotify or wherever you get your podcast. We are on almost every podcast platform. You know, whether you're on Google Podcast or Amazon Music, you can listen to us anywhere you'd like to consume. Just give us a 5-star rating or a good review if you so please. We would really appreciate the feedback. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe on the YouTube page. Comment, who is Drew Holiday's daddy? And barring that, we appreciate you guys for listening, and we will catch you guys in the next one. Mainstream Mavs signing out.
Bye-bye.